Welcome, fellow castigators. I've once again watched an episode of the new series of Doctor Who so that you don't have to. This time it's 73 Yards with Russell T Davies back on writing duty. I need to give you a quick summation so that you can get a feel for just how empty this episode is, and I'll give a few critiques along the way that don't fit into my main point. The episode begins with no theme song, which feels like a crime, and then the TARDIS lands on a cliff top in Wales. The Doctor and Ruby come across a string circle full of notes mentioning a man named Mad Jack. The only Mad Jack in the area the Doctor knows is a Prime Minister who blows up the world with nuclear warfare in 2046. The Doctor accidentally breaks the circle with his foot, causing him to disappear, which Ruby does not see. She attempts to enter the TARDIS, which has locked her out. Ruby then sees an old woman far away who seems to teleport backwards as Ruby attempts to approach her. A hiker, played by Susan Twist, comes along and Ruby asks if they've met before. I haven't mentioned it before, but Susan Twist has played a seemingly insignificant character in every episode thus far, which I figured was Russell T Davies just putting the spotlight on one of his friends like he always does. I guess since they've pointed it out, it must be important after all. She must be Ruby's mother or something silly like that. Anyway, Ruby has the hiker approach the old woman following her, but upon the meeting, the hiker runs away, screaming. Ruby enters an inn and asks for a room for the night. The bartender charges her 65 quid for one night in her shabby little inn, which is highway robbery. Ruby mentions she's being followed, and the bartender charges her 5 quid for a Coke. I'm less concerned for where the Doctor is and more for the absolute state of the Wales economy. A guy in the pub goes to confront the old woman, but he too runs away screaming. The patrons then explain that Ruby has broken a fairy circle and unleashed the ghost of Mad Jack, a dead lunatic, but the long sequence turns out to be a prank. Ruby gets kicked out of the inn after an indeterminate amount of time, so she goes home and tells her adoptive mom that she's being followed. Ruby's mom calls her on the phone and then approaches the woman so that she can hear what is said. However, Ruby hears nothing, and Ruby's mom runs away. She hilariously gets into a taxi and speeds off. There's a poorly implied jump in time, and we see Ruby returning home with groceries and her Sherpa-lined leather jacket, which I guess she dropped off at her flat at some point. Ruby's mum has returned and locked Ruby out. There's another jump, and Ruby meets Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, who confirms that the old woman stays exactly 73 yards away from Ruby. Kate sends some psychically trained unit agents to apprehend the old woman, but they turn away and so does Kate, who hears the woman through her earpiece. Kate and unit leave with hilarious speed, leaving Ruby to tantrum. Ruby's hair length shows us the passage of time, and we see her get dumped by many men. She is awkwardly discussing her sex life in a pub when she gets distracted by a politician on TV, Roger Gwilliam, who is nicknamed Mad Jack. We are supposed to believe that Ruby is 20 years older because her makeup is more orangey, and she wears pointy glasses now. Ruby goes to volunteer at Mad Jack's headquarters, where she's lucky enough to get close to Jack by carrying his entourage's coats. Jack reveals in an interview that he wants to stockpile missiles, and there's another time jump to Mad Jack becoming Prime Minister. I guess Ruby has been doing a pretty bad job of taking him down. Ruby uses her phone to track being 73 yards away from Jack, so that he will interact with the old woman and run away. Mad Jack resigns, and Ruby returns home in satisfaction. 40 years later, Ruby is now crusty and old, so she visits the TARDIS on the cliff one last time. Ruby is finally approached by the old woman, and then she dies. She becomes the Phantom Woman and sees herself and the Doctor on the cliff. She waves her arms vigorously, and young Ruby stops the Doctor from breaking the fairy circle, who now seems to recognize that it is indeed a fairy circle. The end. Now, it should be noted that what I related to you in a few minutes is dragged on for eternity through a 50-minute episode. I was really with it at the start. The atmosphere was good and the variables were interesting enough to hold my attention, but none of the variables go anywhere. I really thought Russell was getting his mojo back, but as usual, he left me with way more questions than answers. Why did the doctor cease to exist? Why does Ruby's older self stay at a distance, and how does she do that? None of this lines up with Welsh fairy lore, so I know it's not that. What does old Ruby say to make people run away? How are the unit operatives affected by it? Why can't Ruby bag a man during her lifetime? What is Russell T. Davies saying about Millie Gibson? Why doesn't Ruby dedicate any of her time to finding the doctor or studying the fairy circle? How does Ruby become the Phantom if it never happens? Did it even happen? What did I just experience? The episode isn't nearly unsettling enough to pass off as a vague and spooky story, and not nearly explanatory enough to pass off as science fiction. Doctor Who is essentially Sherlock Holmes in space. It's the solving of the mystery that is ultimately satisfying. It felt like I was watching an episode of Twin Peaks, where nothing meaningful ever happens, but the variables are just specific enough that people will come to their own conclusion and call it brilliant. I hate to break it to you, but if the writer doesn't have a conclusion, then it isn't brilliant. Russell keeps trying to recreate midnight, but just like with Wild Blue Yonder, he doesn't seem to understand that the humans trapped in the shuttle, both literally and figuratively becoming the monster, is what made it work. He seems to think that indefinite plot devices and slight spookiness is all it takes to make a great episode. It's almost like he wrote Midnight by accident. That being said, Millie Gibson is very good in this, and although Ruby still isn't written with any distinct personality traits, Millie still gets her chance to prove that she has the chops to lead an episode. Before the episode started to get dumb, I was actually enjoying watching Ruby do whatever. Something else I noticed is that something about Ncuti Gatwa really annoys me. In my previous videos, I've been trying not to blame the actors for all the painful moments, but Ncuti's absence made me realize that the show is better without him. I still think he's objectively a good actor, but something about him really grinds my gears. I didn't notice it until now, and I'd be really interested to know how you guys feel about him in the comments. Anyway, my point is that Russell has written yet another episode where barely anything happens, or has any bearing on the characters. 73 Yards plays as pretentious A24 nonsense that in the end proves to be a complete and total waste of time. It's competently directed for once, but that doesn't cover the fact that there's one clever idea in the whole piece. Ruby using the distant Phantom to defeat the Prime Minister is great stuff, and I wish Russell T. Davies had been able to write a coherent story around the concept. I would also like to mention that we are now halfway through this new season and have yet to experience anything smashing. Sure, Boom was okay, but even that was filled with too many half-baked ideas and not enough character development. Even the die-hard apologists of this new take on Doctor Who agreed that Space Babies and the Devil's Cord were not strong openers. But now it's looking more and more like Russell isn't going to give us anything worth our time at all. It's just as I warned. RTD2 is not the savior of Doctor Who that many foolishly hoped that he would be. Nevertheless, I shall journey onward with an open mind. If you would like me to continue watching this series so that you don't have to, then you can subscribe and join me soon for episode 5, Dot and Bubble. Thanks for listening.